What about Theft Act investigation methods? There is, of course, the surveillance and covert operations. This is your movie stuff. There is invigilation. We know we invigilate students for the exam. It's exactly the same thing. Invigilation, where we actually are controlling the operations of the organization to get information, the before and after of, and see if there's any difference in the fraud or the movement of cash, the movement of assets, and so forth. We'll talk more about that shortly. There is the obtaining physical evidence, and then the gathering of electronic information. Now, before I go further, I just want to convince you that all of these are not just theoretical pie in the sky methods. They are real investigation methods that are taking place today in Australia, elsewhere in the world as we speak. How do we know this? Because here's an example of Australian fraud cases. I've collected 28 of them from the Commonwealth Fraud Prevention Centre. And you got the link here, and you can check them out for yourself. And we can go through each of these columns. But here, I just want to show you what investigations were undertaken to find out the fraud, to convict the fraudster, as it has happened in the last 2 or 3 years. Here we have internal surveillance for the first one. We have internal invigilation undertaken. Behind me here, look at that. We have internal surveillance, we have external covert operations, and we have external surveillance. Wow. All right. This stuff is real. It is going on. And if you don't believe me, look at the other 14, 15, or 16. We have covert operations undergoing. We have internal surveillance. We had external surveillance, more external surveillance, internal invigilation going on to actually discover, to collect the evidence, to convict the fraudster. Okay, so these things I'm talking about are real. They are happening. So let's get into each of these investigation types. And I've graphed them again in terms of the number of times they have occurred. Notice out of those 28, audit evidence was produced in 15 occasions, public reports in 3 occasions, internal surveillance 3 occasions, external surveillance 3 occasions, internal invigilation twice, covert operations once, and internal covert operations once. And you can see the money or the losses associated with surveillance as 40 million for internal surveillance, and even for covert operations associated with nearly $30 million in US of fraud losses alone. So these investigation methods, although they may be costly, you can see that they are not that costly compared to the frauds that they need to uncover. Wow. And of course, the role of audit evidence is plain to see. It is always there and very important, because you can take audit documentation evidence to court because it doesn't change once you have got it. All right. So let's get into some of these different investigation methods. All right. Surveillance. So we have types of surveillance, and that is electronic. You've got stationary, fixed point, or moving and tailing. And in the textbook, they actually talk about the most risky part is moving surveillance or tailing surveillance, where you actually have to follow. You have to drive behind, you tail someone secretly and not be too far behind. This is out of the movie stuff, but it does happen. And people have lost their lives in the process of moving or tailing surveillance. So that's why fraud investigators that do such surveillance receive a lot of money. They are taking risks with their life. And it's not just a 9 to 5 job. It's weekend, night work. It is early morning hours work as well. All right. So keep these things in mind. Read that area of the textbook, and it tells you some very interesting scenes of the moving and tailing, which, if you're not interested by now, this stuff will make you interested. Or go and watch a few crime thriller movies. You will see what I'm talking about. All right. And again, the definition of surveillance is all about watching and recording. We're trying to get physical facts. We're trying to get facts on the acts and movements when kickbacks are made. All right. That's the act of a vendor paying one of your employees in response, the employee gives the vendor favor in terms of giving a higher price or making sure that vendor wins in a bid, as you knew from the last LMS 6, where we looked at different suppliers that won the bidding more often than others. All right. And then you got the theft act of a fraud. All right. So here's an example of a surveillance log. The textbook is saying that if you're going to do it, if you're going to pay someone to do surveillance, you need to expect some detail, like what is happening every 5, 10, 15 minutes over a 2, 3, 4-hour period, as is shown here. All right, because we need this order. We need a timestamp, because when we go to court, when we go evidence, we need it to be watertight to be producible in court. Wow. All right. Now, invigilation, the second type of investigative method. You know what it's like when you're being watched over or monitored in an exam, but the key element is detailed record keeping before, during, and after the invigilation, because it's kind of like an experiment. You record what is going on before the invigilation, then the invigilation period is where you might launch a particular monitoring operation. And so the fraudster, they know indirectly, not directly, that you're trying to cover them. They know indirectly that they maybe should not do anything just during that time, and then you stop it. And then you let the fraudster go on afterwards. And then you can compare how much money was skimmed before, during, and after. And then that's a way of getting prima facie evidence, the predication of fraud again. The key element is detailed record keeping again. All right. The purpose is to impose controls like an experiment. And again, it is an investigative technique. As you know, you have been in exams where you are closely supervised, as in through, during an examination period. Next, we have physical evidence. So first is the types of physical evidence. That's the easy part, because physical is what you see is what you get, right? Inventory, assets, broken locks, substances, grease and fluids, impressions, cutting marks, tire tracks, fingerprints, yes, traces, paints and stains. So that's the type of physical evidence. And that is more likely where you have suspect of inventory related fraud. So there's been physical theft of inventory. The stock take doesn't work out. And so you want to find out, well, what is going on? So the electronic evidence may not tell you everything about physically that's going on in the organization. Now, the electronic and computer evidence, that's a little bit more complicated, because there are so many more streams and things to think about. And because of that, when we go into the next part, part D, we will see you in another video. See you soon.